I have had the privilege to travel in South America quite a bit, in countries like Bolivia and Paraguay, Colombia, Mexico. These precious resources that we hold in our hands are not very common in Spanish. Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world. We English speakers are actually behind them. There's more Spanish speakers than English speakers. This is a major world language. We need material in this language. As I would teach seminars to eager parents, class after class, to dedicated mission students at mission schools, no books, maybe a few of the basics, maybe Steps to Christ, something like that. But when I would say, hey, bring your book education to class tomorrow, well, we don't have that book. We don't have access to these things. And this is at a school in Colombia that I spent about 6 weeks at teaching, and some precious students there from Brazil who were at the school. How I wanted to give books to them, materials that they could go back to their country with. Alas, I had nothing to give them. I had the privilege to travel into the Andes Mountains in Colombia to visit an indigenous tribe there in the mountains. They live a self-sustaining lifestyle. And our purpose of our visit was one man. This was the path to his home. This is his garden. He's the only Seventh-day Adventist in his community, in that whole tribe, in that area. It brought tears to his eyes. The fact that we visited him brought him some bananas. And I wanted to give him books. He would have devoured some reading material. Nothing to give him. Here's a school also in Colombia. Here's a group of students from Bolivia at that school. Oh, they were so hungry for books. Don't you have anything, they asked me. Sorry, I don't have anything. Here I'm at a school in Paraguay. Again, hungry for material. Even the English material I had, they're just, well, maybe I can learn English. And they would buy it because they just wanted to read it. How much do we struggle here in the U.S. to get books into people's hands? And people are hungry for it there. This is a school in Bolivia that I've had the privilege to be at twice. It's quite an adventure to get there, actually. No bridge there. That's a river. 1 river, 2 river, 3 rivers, 4 rivers, 5 rivers, actually 6 rivers to access this school. Deep in the mountains, probably one of the best examples of God's plan of education at work, faithfully following a mission training program. They are sending missionaries all over South America. A rich work that they are doing. But no books, no materials, nothing that they could take back with them. Why? Well, as I learned about the situation over the past few years, I found several situations. To put it succinctly, for the books that are translated, there aren't many, but for the ones that are, they're often too expensive to be able to purchase for the average person. Others are translated imperfectly or incomplete. For example, Fundamentals of Christian Education in English, that's got about 400 some pages. You go to the one in Spanish, there's only a couple of hundred pages. There's major portions missing that haven't been translated. But many simply are not translated. A lot of material. Some of the stuff I was quoting from this morning, it has not been translated. And so when I would finish a seminar or a class, I had nothing to leave behind. It was a beautiful start to these understanding of these principles, but no follow-up that was available. And I felt sad. I felt more than sad. I felt responsible. I felt indignant that those of us sitting comfortably here hold this material in our hands, and I felt like we should be responsible for getting it translated, printed, distributed into these countries. And so this was the burden on my heart for a few years as I continued in ministry. And for several years I made efforts with no success. Several people volunteered to translate, and it would just fizzle and nothing was accomplished. And some of you are saying, well, why not pay to have it done? Here's why. So let me explain how translation works. So you have a book, and there's 3 important components. You have the translation and proofreading costs, you have interior layout and design, and then you have the cover and the ISBN and barcode and miscellaneous aspects of that, all adding up to a total. Now that is based on a word count. So take the book education. Anyone want to guess how many words are in the book? It's something we don't really have a concept of, right? How many words are in this book? It's about 80,000 words. So the standard translation rate in the secular world is about 12 cents per word. That adds up really fast. Any of you who are mathematicians know how high that is. Now, if you go with a standard missionary rate within the church here, I have a friend who worked for the Inter-American Division as a translator. That's about 7.5 cents per word. Okay, so let's take our book education. Interior layout and design, 3 to 5 cents a word maybe, but again, a basic missionary rate around 1 cent per word. Cover, barcode, etc. Again, very cheap rate, $500. So I'm giving you here a number that is absolute cheapest you could get to pay and get translation done. So take the book education, 80,000 words. Well, that's $6,000 for translation, $800, $500, adding up to $7,364. Okay, what about if you wanted to do a bigger book, Fundamentals of Christian Education? See how quickly this adds up. What if we have many titles that we want to do? Can you see why we haven't been paying to have translation done? We didn't have this in the budget. And so these years were going by and like, Lord, we need the money, we need something. When are we going to solve this problem for our friends who are speaking Spanish? I was visiting a friend's house. He asked me, this was the beginning of last year, in January, and he said, so if you had any big projects to do, what would it be? I hadn't told a soul about this idea other than my own family. And usually I would respond, well, I'd like to get a DVD done. I'd like to get this film project done. I'd like to, write a book and different things. But the Lord put it in my mind to talk about the translation work. I said, well, actually, and I explained what I just explained. He said, this work needs to happen. He handed me a little bit later $1,500. He said, get to it, or something like that. I said, well, $1,500 is nice, but that's not going to work. But I started. I said, okay, the Lord has given me the start. Let's get going. So I started talking to translators. I heard, sorry, I'm involved with another ministry now. Contacted another one. Well, I'm not really qualified for this. Contacted another one. Sure, I'd be glad to help you. This is a great project. A few months later, well, I've been kind of busy. Translator 2. Sure, I'd love to help you. And sorry, I've been so busy. Translator 5. Yeah, it went like that over and over. Another one did volunteer and was working, but it was slow progress because of a busy schedule. So one day I took it to the Lord in prayer. This was August or September of last year. I said, Lord, we've got to get this moving. Meanwhile, people had been giving small amounts. We had a little bit to work with. I messaged a friend of mine from Guatemala. I said, do you know any good translators? I'm ready to start just paying to have this done and trust the Lord to provide rather than relying on volunteers. She said, I do actually know a professional translator. She's really good. Let me contact her. She messaged a little bit back a little bit later. The lady said she's a professional translator and proofreader. She said, sure, I'll have your book done in a month, and I want to support this project. I'll do it for 2 cents a word. I said, let's get going. She's been turning out a book pretty much every month now. Interior layout and design professional, also an expensive part. She said, I believe in this work. I won't charge you a thing. Bilingual publishing manager the Lord provided. Right at the time when our previous publishing manager for the ministry had to quit, the Lord provided us a bilingual publishing manager, taking a huge load off my shoulders to take care of all the communication. I'm fairly fluent in Spanish myself, but it was great to have her being able to take care of all this. So, new totals, free interior layout and design, dropping our totals significantly, changing the translation to 2 cents a word, dropping the totals significantly. When my friend asked me how much money we would need, I said maybe around $20,000, thinking that was absolutely crazy, more money than we'd dealt with. Well, we've now translated these 5 titles: Fundamentals of Christian Education, Special Testimonies on Education, Living Fountains or Broken Cisterns, Studies in Christian Education, and The Cross and its Shadow. Those 5 titles we've completed for a little under $10,000. The math does not add up, but the Lord wanted this project to go forward. So now we have been moving forward with this, and I finished these 5 just in time for another trip to Bolivia, to that same school where you had to cross 6 rivers to get to. That trip was amazing in and of itself. Bolivia was in the middle of political unrest and blockades. The people from the mission couldn't even get to the airport. I was in a taxi driving through back roads in the middle of Santa Cruz in the middle of the night. Thankful for my guardian angel. That was exciting. But we finished these 5 books just before I left and boxed them up. When I explained to the ticket agent at the airline counter what they were for, they waived the fees and let me take them in. The travel itself was exciting, but we crossed those rivers yet again and got to the school. Now this school, I spent 10 days of classes, almost 40 hours of teaching there. Probably one of the best schools I've ever been to. Absolutely incredible. This is a group of self-sacrificing, dedicated missionaries. I believe if we had 10 of these schools in the world, the work would be finished. It is just amazing. They spent a little bit of time, some of the second-year students were sharing their experiences, and someone asked them, "What is the greatest miracle you've experienced here?" And the responses brought tears to my eyes. One student said, "The greatest miracle I've experienced here, I've been rescued from sin." Another one said, "Before I only knew God as a God who created the world. Now I know him as a friend." Life transforming. Some more of these eager young people. It's a beautiful location. I had a chance on a free day to climb up into the mountains right behind the school. This is the view just up from the school. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous area. Oh, but when I said I had books in Spanish with me, you'd have thought it was piranhas. When I laid those out on the table, you would not believe the excitement. It was incredible. I spoke to the director about the project. I told him a little bit about it. He got tears in his eyes. He said, "We have been waiting for years for this material." Some of these students would take the books, they'd go just sit down. I saw one student just holding them, just feeling them. Some of them started reading. I made the mistake of giving them out in between class periods. I lost a few students for the next class period. They were busy reading. Hey, that's okay. And again, we struggle to get books out here in the U.S., and they're hungry for them. I want to introduce you to 2 students. This is Ariel. He was very high up in martial arts and competitive sports. He left it all to serve the Lord. And he went into being a colporteur. Now, here in the U.S., when we say colporteur, it's kind of this self-sacrificing thing you do on your own. In South America, they have very organized programs for colporteurs. College students take part in them. They're huge programs, very competitive, and these students compete for the top positions to get out as many books as they can. Unfortunately, they're not always the greatest of books, but they work with what they have. This young man went into being a colporteur and was 3rd in the nation. This young man, Andres, his father left when he was young. He went into business to support his mother. He was apart from God, so he left all and came to this school to follow the Lord. He was 2nd in the nation as a colporteur. You think these 2 young men know what to do with some books? They're expert. Unfortunately, they don't have them. They only had this handful of books I was able to give them, a copy for each of them. So there's where we come to phase 2 of this project. We've had an amazing start. I'm so grateful that the Lord has provided for us to do the translation work, and we continue to translate more. We solicit your prayers and support for this. But it's one thing to have the books translated. It's quite another to get them printed and distributed, right? into the hands of those who want them so badly. So we've done research, and rather than printing the books here in the U.S. and shipping them there, that's not a very economical way to do it. It's much better to print them in the country. And so we've started doing this, and though it is more economical, it does require a lot of money because as you talk about a printing in every country, it adds up quickly. Now, as the books are sold, the funds can go forward toward future printings, but we need the money to get started. The minimum amount or quantity to print is about 1,000 copies to get a good price. You want to start with printing 1,000 copies. The amount will depend on the size of the book, the quantity, but on average, maybe $2.50 or $3 per book if you're printing 1,000 copies. So you do the math there. 1,000 copies, you're looking at $3,000. If you want to do 6 titles, you're looking at $18,000. We have Seventh-day Adventist printers ready to work with us in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Mexico. 18,000 times 3 countries, now you're at $54,000. You see how quickly this adds up? And we don't have these funds. At the end of the year, I stepped out in faith and literally emptied our bank account to print 3 titles in Ecuador and 3 in Bolivia. Yesterday, after I arrived at the Lanfears, my contact in Bolivia, the director of this mission, sent me this picture. Wow. Oh, it's so exciting. That's 3,000 books right there ready to get distributed, and we are thankful for that. But as I said, I emptied the bank account to do this, and so we are praying. I've asked the Lord for $50,000 to get this project going. We want to get the books out. What are we told we should do? The leaves of autumn, right? That's more than 3,000. Anyone seen any leaves come down? Anyone counted them? That's more than just a few. And so, last year I thought 20,000 was crazy. Now 50,000 seems pretty crazy, but I know the Lord can take care of it. And so I believe we have a great responsibility to see this work. And there's many calls, I recognize. There are many calls on our funds. There are many calls for needs. And I love that statement. I think it's in 3rd Testimony, 6th Testimonies, I don't remember. But it says, people complain, oh, this ministry needs funds and this ministry needs funds, and there keeps climbing all these different needs. And the response to that in Testimonies, it says, yes, and I hope they increase because it means the work is being finished. We are doing our best to finish the work. So if any of you would like to help support this project, you can come and talk to me afterward, or you can go to the website. That's at thinkinggeneration.org/donate, and you'll see there the different projects that we're working on, and you can contribute to a specific project. So thank you for your time in that. I hope it's inspiring, at least to hear of the work. Now let's move over to our main presentation this afternoon, and I wanted to pass out for anyone who wants more information on the ministry. Feel free to take one of these cards. It has both the website and more information about the ministry there. You can just pass them around if you'd like one. The battle for the mind. There was a TED Talk. Anyone watch TED Talks? All right, TED Talk's pretty interesting. Your brain plus the cloud equals superhumans. A Google engineer predicts nanocomputers connected to the cloud will be implanted in our brains by 2030. Now that's a pretty crazy idea. Nanocomputers implanted in our brains that connect to the cloud will usher in a new era of critical thinking and human advancement, Google's director of engineering predicts in a TED Talk. Okay, critical thinking, that's a good thing. Thanks. Human advancement, that's a good thing. I don't know I like the method, though. Ray Kurzweil, he's one of those Google guys, says that by the 2030s, nanobots embedded through the bloodstream into our brains will create hybrid minds that combine the current power of our brain with the almost limitless processing capacity of cloud-based computers. These microcomputers will help us get quick answers to complex problems and will provide the extra juice needed to come up with creative new ideas. Did you catch what they said here? They want to combine the current power of our brain with the limitless processing capacity of cloud-based computers. Do you see what they're saying? By inference, they're saying, we can do better than God. Our computers are unlimited. The brain is limited. Elon Musk, there's a name I'm sure we're familiar with by now, wants to connect computers to your brain so we can keep up with robots. Who's keeping up with who? There's a deeper issue here, though. Who controls a robot? Does the robot control itself? Or does something else, the programmer, control the way the robot acts? So here's the prediction. With the help of brain implants that are directly linked to computers, humans may be able to improve their brain function or even one day upload their thoughts or download the thinking of others. What exactly? Can you imagine? I mean, imagine just wake up one day. I don't have any good ideas. Who's got some good? John, he's got good ideas. And so you just think it up on Google somehow, and I can read his thoughts and download his ideas to my brain. Just the idea of reading each other's thoughts is frightening enough. But do you see where this is going? I mean, it's not spelled out this way, but think about the implications here. Who's controlling the mind of the human? Who's controlling the mind here? Is the human or the cloud-based computer system doing the control? Now let's compare this with what we're told. God has given men talents, which he means they should use. He has given them minds, and he means that they should become thinkers and do their own planning and thinking rather than depend upon others to think and plan for them. Why did God give us a mind? To think, to use. Now, I want to clarify. I'm not suggesting this is the future of the world. I personally feel like God is not going to let it get that far. But regardless, I'm actually suggesting that the future looks a lot worse than this, because if we look at society today, thinking is at an all-time low. A study found more than 80% of employers said recent graduates were deficient in critical thinking. Any employers here? John's one of them. Would you agree? Deficient in critical thinking skills? Yeah. Another study found, I think it may have been connected with a study, I don't remember, that among high school graduates, it was less than 1% that were actually skilled at critical thinking. Less than 1%. That's a major problem, right? Now, scientists tell us that around half, actually a little less than half the population, are even capable of engaging in the highest level of thinking, called formal reasoning, Piaget's level of formal reasoning. Less than half the population. But how many do you think actually engage in it? Far less than this. It's actually around 5% actually engage in the power of independent thinking. Is this an issue, though? We're told moral purity depends on right thinking. Who wants to be morally pure? Moral purity depends on it. Young men must be trained up to be thinkers, so it should be part of the educational process to train to be a thinker. And God calls upon everyone with whom he works to do the very highest kind of thinking. So it depends on moral purity, or I should say moral purity depends on right thinking. It should be part of the educational process. And if we want to work with the Lord, we need to be a thinker. Sounding pretty important. But now, let's come to the crux of this. Education, page 17, coming from this amazing book. Every human being created in the image of God. Are we all humans here? No non-humans? All right, so every one of us is given a power akin to that of the Creator. What does this word akin mean? It's an Old English word. Anyone know? It means like or similar to. All right? So when God created man, he said, I want to give them a power that I myself have, because he created man in his own image. What is it? Individuality, power to think and to do. Power to think and to do. Power, in other words, to make decisions. Power to make a decision and know the reason why you made the decision. Because here's the key to what we're discussing. The type of thinking we're talking about is that word individuality. Because when you talk about thinking, maybe you know somebody who's really smart. Are they a good thinker? Maybe, maybe not. Just being smart doesn't guarantee that you'll be a good thinker. Maybe you know somebody with a couple of PhDs. Are they a good thinker? Maybe, maybe not. That's no guarantee. The type of thinking we're talking about is individuality, individual thinking, the power to think and to do, the power to reason and to make a decision. The power of individual thought is the power to make a decision and know why you made that decision. And if you look around the world today, ask somebody a political question. What kind of response are you going to get? Is it going to be an original, thought-out response, or is it going to be parroting whatever their favorite side of the issue is? Right? For example, individuality, power to think and to do, to make a decision, to understand why you made the decision. This is vital for the last days. We're talking about Daniel this morning. Do you think he was a thinker? He had to be. If he was going along with what everyone else was doing, we wouldn't have the story of Daniel in the Bible. The power of individual thought is the ability to formulate a belief, know the reason why you made that decision. And that is key for the end times, because there's going to come a time when everyone, it will seem, is doing something different from what we're doing. And we're going to need to swim against that current. And we may not think that we run the risk of this, but as we're going to talk about, there's been a very dedicated, a very focused attack on our thinking abilities in recent years. Let's just take probably one of the most obvious, these things we hold in our hands. The more time we spend looking at, let's take social media, for example, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, what else, we're looking at what someone else has thought, what someone else is doing, and we begin reflecting someone else's thoughts instead of formulating our own. And it's interesting to follow this up with the very next statement. It says, it is the work of what kind of education? True education, to develop this power. Which one? The one we just read about, individual thought. To train the youth to be thinkers and not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts. When I first read this, this was my aha moment as an educator. I said, oh, that makes more sense. I'd seen in the classroom. I saw the methods of education that were prominent, and I realized that there were here set forth two completely distinct systems of education. Thinkers, or what's the other word used there? We had a good lunch, didn't we? Thinkers or reflectors, exactly. Thinkers or reflectors. Thinkers in that power of individual thought to formulate a decision, to stand on that decision, though the heavens fall, because you have a reason for it. Or a reflector who just does what everyone else does and thinks the way everyone else thinks. And as I thought about this, I said, wow, isn't this what we're doing in education? Year after year, we give students a collection of textbooks, and what do we tell them to do with it? Memorize it. Just remember it, right? Someone thought of it, someone created it, someone explained it perfectly, you just have to commit it to memory. Said, whoa, we're training reflectors, not thinkers, which by default tells us if it's the work of true education to develop a thinker, then what's a reflector part of? That's false education. And I want to clinch in the idea that this is vital for our spiritual success. Because the end time battle is a battle over who is controlling our mind. Turn with me to Revelation. A couple of verses I'm sure we know well. Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7. Verses 2 and 3. Chapter 7, 2 and 3. I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. Angels coming with the seal of God. Who wants the seal of God? Don't we all, right? And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of God in their foreheads. Not feet, not shoulder, not the back of the head, the forehead. What is the significance of the forehead? What does that represent? I mean, is this a rubber stamp? Comes along? No, this is symbolic. The mind, thinking skills. In fact, we could talk about some science. The anterior cingulate cortex, this is an area of the brain that's been researched a lot more recently. The anterior cingulate cortex is part of the frontal lobe, deep, it's in the yellow here, deep within the frontal lobe. It's important for many functions, not the least of which is the last two on the list there, error detection and the center of the free will. Recognizing, discerning between truth and error. Is that an important thing, a function for a Christian? Vital. And the center of the free will, the ability to make moral decisions, is centered in this part of the brain. What is God saying in Revelation? Placing my seal on your moral decision-making abilities. In other words, God says, you've reached a point when I know every decision you make will be for God's side and not Satan's. But just a minute. Is God the only one who wants our minds devoted to him? Turn to Revelation 14. Revelation 14. Verse 9. The third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand. The seal of God placed on the forehead. The mark of the beast placed where? Forehead or the hand, which is an interesting distinction. God wants us to choose to follow him. Satan will be happy to try to force us to follow him. But regardless, both sides in this great controversy are aiming for the forehead, for the moral decision-making abilities. This end-time battle is a battle over who is controlling your mind. And there's many other scriptures we could look at. Probably one that we all know well, Isaiah 1:18. Come, let us reason together, God says. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. I think about Romans 12, verse 2. Be not conformed to the world, God says. In other words, don't be a reflector going along with what everyone else is doing, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. 1 Peter 1:13. Wherefore gird up the loins of your mind, we're told. This is a theme throughout the scriptures. God wants our minds devoted to him, reasoning. Now, some people will say, well, reason and faith can't go together. Have you heard this, right? How can you be, people say, Brother John was talking to me yesterday about Scientology. They're like, we can reason our way through this. Faith is for weak people. I believe God wants us to have an evidence-based faith. An evidence-based faith. Do we have evidence-based faith? Do we have evidence? Do we have scriptural evidence for what we believe? We can prove it right here. If we can't prove it here, we've got problems. There are some things we don't understand. We can't see God, for example, and so we have to exercise faith. But he's given us enough evidence in his word that we can base our faith upon that. That's part of being a thinker. And we read, the warfare in which we are engaged is largely mental. We're not fighting a battle of swords and guns. We're fighting a battle of the mind. Carter Woodson, a famous historian, said, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. Think Satan knows that? Yeah, that's why he's aiming for control of the mind. There was a famous leader who, at the height of his career, was loved, adored by his country. He was voted in by a popular vote, the great majority of the vote. And he once said, "How fortunate for leaders that men do not think." Anyone know who that was? It was Adolf Hitler. How fortunate for leaders that men do not think. We often think that Hitler forced his way into power. No, he was elected by a great majority of the vote. And he said, why am I enjoying this popularity? No one's thinking. And we think, well, I would have never done that. It was Christians who voted Hitler into power. Over 90% of Seventh-day Adventists voted for Hitler. That should make us think. No one was thinking, right? No one saw the direction this was going. No one was basing their decision on the Word of God. And that's why it is the special work of Satan in these last days to take possession of the minds of our youth. And it's not just the youth, it's our children. It's all ages. It's adults, it's children, it's everyone. Satan is trying to take possession of the mind. And so I want to talk this in the remaining time that we have about some practical ways in which Satan is damaging the development of the mind and good thinking abilities. I've titled it 10 Thought Destroying Tactics. Let's start with some practical ones. A lack of physical activity. We talked this morning of how physical activity is a fundamental part of education. We saw some benefits of that. It may seem a little out of place. Okay, we're talking about thinking skills, and now you say I need to go exercise? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the research shows that for a young child, physical activity is more important than the time they spend studying. There's a lot of reasons for this. Talk about a few areas of the brain. The cerebellum, one of them. The cerebellum is linked with the higher frontal levels in the brain. About 40% of the neurons in the cerebellum connect into the frontal lobe. Very influential in good thinking abilities. It helps with the ability to perform repetitive activities automatically, like handwriting, many cognitive skills, many language skills, social interaction, music, and attention, all centered in the cerebellum. Anyone use their cerebellum yet today? Like 3 of you have. Okay, that's good. Right, we all have, right? It's a vital part of the brain. And so you say, why are we bringing this up? Physical activity directly helps the cerebellum develop. Movement, physical activity. Hippocampus, another part of the brain, vital for the development of memory, spatial navigation, behavior, and emotion. Again, physical activity develops the hippocampus. The corpus callosum, it is the connection between the hemispheres of the brain that helps with cognition, motor skills, sensory information, and much more. Again, physical activity helps develop the corpus callosum. It is vital. The research has made this clear. What's really fascinating, here we have a diagram showing us the corpus callosum, which is in the center from which all these different colored fibers reach out. The corpus callosum is the connection between the hemispheres, located there in the center. And this is showing us the different parts of the corpus callosum and the areas of the brain that they connect with. See the different colors, okay? The part at the front of the corpus callosum, which is on our left, represented in the red, what part of the brain is this? Frontal lobe, okay? It all connects down, my pointer doesn't work here on the screen, but it all connects down to the very front tip there of the corpus callosum, which is called the genu of the corpus callosum. The genu of the corpus callosum has been found to be directly affected by physical activity. So what they found is the more physical activity a child is getting, the more it was helping develop the frontal lobe, which is that moral decision-making part of the brain. So literally, physical activity helps children make better decisions. What kind of activity? Did you know rocking? Now, I don't mean the child rocking. I mean the mother holding the baby and rocking them actually helps develop the brain. Incredible. Crawling. They find children who crawl more have better reading abilities. It connects the areas of the brain. Reading is a very whole brain activity. Interestingly, they're actually using crawling now as a treatment program for children with learning disabilities. They might be 9, 10 years of age, and they have them crawl because it helps connect parts of the brain. Spinning, hanging upside down. I mean, kids love doing these things, right? And adults not so much. It helps the brain develop. Here's a quote from scientist Dr. Jane Healy. After birth, physical activities are one of the child's main means of advancing physical, intellectual, and emotional growth, so you should encourage many forms of body movement. What form of body movement did we learn this morning was better than all the rest? You remember? No line of manual training is of more value than agriculture. All right. This is one of the best forms of physical activity. Every child, we've already seen this slide, but every child should be involved in the garden. Point number 2, we're talking about ways in which Satan is attacking the development of the brain. Overstimulation. Overstimulation is an interesting term. It's describing when we overwhelm the brain with too much input, and this can take different forms. Too many toys. We want to keep our children occupied, right? So we give them toys. Did you know they find that the more toys a child has, the more bored they are? Kind of backwards, isn't it, right? But when they don't have as many toys, they actually learn to focus more. Too much in the schedule. We want to keep them busy. It's school, it's homework, it's dance, it's music, and we pack that day full of activities. That's actually overstimulating to the mind. They need quiet, simple time. Too much school. School's a good thing, but too much of it, very damaging to the brain. Media, we're going to talk about that this evening. Media is overstimulating in and of itself. And what this does is it overwhelms the mind, and it causes a lot of problems. Did you know the National Survey of Children's Health found a 20% increase in anxiety for children ages 6 to 17 between 2007 and 2012? 20% increase in anxiety in children. Children should not have anxiety problems. But what we find is as we pressure children to all this stuff we're expecting out of them at an early age, especially in the academic sort of realm, they have anxiety problems because of it. And it causes the brain to just reach this point. It can't handle everything. And so we start to see problems like stress. Children should not be stressed. Overactivity. Have we seen problems with overactivity in children? That's very connected with diet also. Frustration, irritability, being grouchy, overtired, and just plain superficial thinking because they don't have time to focus on one thing. Children need quiet time, quiet and simple. Really what they need, back into the country, right? Time in nature, time to explore. I mean, what happened to go outside and play? How many grew up in this generation? Well, you lived outside every chance you got. That's really good for childhood. Unfortunately, we're losing this. Dr. Raymond Moore, in his book, School Can Wait, wrote, quietness, calmness, and freedom from artificial excitement build strength in the immature child. Point number 3, too much study. Very much linked with overstimulation. Study is a great thing. I mean, I love to study. Nothing wrong with study. It needs to be at the right age. We don't have time to go into that a lot this afternoon, but I mentioned earlier this morning, until the age of 8 or 10, children should not have a lot of pressure in academic skills. It's better actually that they don't go to school until at least the age of 8 or 10. Study is a good thing, but we can have too much. And too much study has been linked to superficial learning, a lot of burnout, illnesses, and learning disabilities, all as a result of just too much study. You say, well, what's too much? Well, as I mentioned this morning, should be dividing the time. Half the day spent in study, half the day in something more practical. But again, I do want to clarify, that's for the older children. Up until the age of around 8 or 10, and I say 8 or 10, we often just say that, but there's actually a gender difference there. Around 8 for girls, around 10 for boys. They need to spend the majority of their time outdoors, doing practical things, learning in practical ways. That's not to say they can't learn some math and science and reading and things like that, but it needs to be in a much more hands-on, practical manner rather than sitting them in the classroom with a textbook. And again, I encourage you, go to our YouTube channel. You can watch. I have a lot of material on that. That is actually the primary area of research that I started with in this work, is this issue of the 8 to 10 years and how we're pushing children into school at an early age when it is damaging all aspects of brain and body development. It is not the healthy environment for them, and it really damages spiritual development also. So again, go to my YouTube channel. You can watch that presentation. Let's look at point number 4, testing. Do we have any classroom teachers here? Okay. Teachers have a penchant for giving tests. It's kind of nice. We like them. But the reality is, it's not actually helping learn. It measures it, but it doesn't actually help them learn. And even then, it's not the greatest way of measuring learning abilities. It's often unfair. There's a great little parable. Here we have the animal school. They're all lined up before the professor, and he says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Who's going to succeed? The monkey, right? Who will fail? The elephant, definitely. The fish. The elephant knock it down, right? So the story goes that once upon a time, the animals decided they needed to do something to meet the demands of the new world. So they organized a school. They adopted a curriculum with 4 subjects. They had running, climbing, swimming, and flying. Running, climbing, swimming, and flying. Great animal school, right? Well, all the animals wanted to get good grades. They were all very motivated learners, so they all tried very hard. We had the duck. Excellent at swimming and flying, even better than his instructor. But he lagged behind his classmates in running and climbing, so he had to stay after school to practice those. He had to drop swimming, but soon his webbed feet were so badly worn from running that he was only average at swimming. There was the squirrel, who was top of the class in climbing and running, second only to the duck at flying, but he developed some frustration issues in the flying class because his teacher insisted that he start at the ground and fly to the top of the tree, and the squirrel said, that's not how you fly. You climb up the tree and you jump and you fly down. So he was always at odds with his teacher. And to make matters worse, as squirrels are wont to do, he was constantly squirming and chattering in class and had difficulty paying attention. And he was diagnosed with a learning disorder. He was eventually placed in remedial classes and had to be medicated in order to continue his schoolwork. Call that Ritalin, right? The rabbit started at the top of his class in running, but had a nervous breakdown because of so much makeup work with swimming. The fox was a natural in his running class, scored well in climbing and swimming, but became pretty frustrated at his inability to get good grades at flying. He developed anger issues and started assaulting his classmates. He once even tried to eat the duck. His behavior was so disruptive, he fell in with a rough crowd and eventually wound up in a center for animal delinquents. Then there was the elephant, who developed low self-esteem because he couldn't do well in any of the subjects. He sank into clinical depression, and his therapist persuaded him to try a different school that focused on subjects like lifting and carrying. Well, the elephant was disappointed because careers in lifting and carrying are not as prestigious as careers in swimming and flying. He always felt inferior, but he did manage to make a decent living and support his family. Then there was the prairie dogs. They stayed out of school. They were quite the problem. They stayed out of school and fought the taxes because the administration would not add digging and burrowing to the curriculum. They apprenticed their children to a badger and later joined the groundhogs and the gophers to start a very successful private school. Underground, right. That's a good one. That's a good one. No, we laugh at this story. Obviously, no such thing ever happened. But can we see the serious side of this? Can we see God created every animal different, right? How crazy it would be to have a program like that. Has God created every child differently? Of course, right? Why? Does God want them to be all the same, and for some reason they just keep coming out different, and God's like, oh, I don't understand it. I want them to all be the same. No. God created, and keeps creating diversity. God values diversity. It's like the body we read about, the body of the church. You have a finger and an arm and a hand and a toe and a head and different parts that all work together. There's unity in that diversity. But the most important reason for this, for the fact that every individual is different, is that God has a specific place for every child in his work. And when we decide that we need to push them through this same mold, like a factory, over and over, same thing, same plan of education, everybody learns the same thing, everybody takes the same tests, we teach them to reflect what someone else has said, we're reducing their capacity to fulfill that place that God has for them in his work. I believe it's an affront to God's creative design. It's been said I'd have more faith in standardized tests if I knew any standard children. Pretty true, right? Comparative assessments create artificial hierarchies that promote unnecessary competition and discourage students from learning. Dr. David Elkind, famous for his book, The Hurried Child, says the factory model of education ignores individual differences in mental abilities and learning rates and learning styles. Children are pressured to meet uniform standards as measured by standardized tests. Those who cannot keep up in this system, as indicated by the test, are often regarded as defective vessels and are labeled learning disabled or ADHD. It's really sad. Education is reforming, which means more basics, more hours, more homework, more testing, more of everything that's creating the problem. It's a classic case of the cure being worse than the disease. Now, this is an important point we need to take. When we have children who have problems in education, we tend to do more of what caused the problem. Maybe we need to take a step back and say, what is actually causing these problems? But let's look at the connection to good thinking abilities. Under these circumstances, children discover very quickly that passing tests rather than meaningful learning is what school is all about. Now, please tell me I'm not the only one. But I learned something when I went to university. I love to study. I love to learn. But I learned that if I wanted to keep up my 4.0 GPA, that meant studying really hard in the evening, taking the test the next morning, and an hour later forgetting everything I wrote down on that test because I had to move on to the next one. I'm not the only one, am I? I learned that taking tests was what school was all about, not learning. Now that was as a young person. What about in childhood? Year after year after year, we're teaching them just take the test, reflect what someone else has told you, remember it long enough to put it down on the test. We're taking away the joy of learning, really. The memorizing necessary for these tests is a linear process that does not require entire brain use. Rote memory is a straight line process requiring none of the depth of understanding that comes from whole brain activation. In short, rote memory does not require thinking. Now, to clarify, is it good to memorize things? Certainly. Should we learn to memorize the Bible? Yeah, we should be committing large portions to memory. But there's a difference between rote memory, which is typically done in school, where I haven't had to discover it, I haven't had to figure it out or come to any conclusions myself. I just take what someone else has already figured out and remember it, versus going through that process of discovery, of investigation, of study, of deepening your understanding of something until you understand it so well that it's stuck in your mind. Anyone experienced this before? You're never going to forget it because you understand it so well. That's true memory. That's not rote memorization, and that requires thinking. You know, and I want to apply this to our spiritual walk especially, and we're talking about it in context of education, but how many find it, I hesitate to say a challenge, but at least hard work to study your Bible? Isn't it hard work? So, yeah, it's a challenge. Good point. Good point. It's much easier in the morning, right? But What I run into a lot as I travel and as I speak, and people tell me, wow, I don't know how you do all that study. There's no way I could do that. And I think, wow, that's just a lie Satan wants to pass off, right? That we have to rely on someone else to do the study for us, even in spiritual things. I want to watch Doug Batchelor and Mark Finley and Stephen Bohr and all these great preachers. They're going to explain it to me, and I come to church on Sabbath morning, and the pastor gives me a great Bible study out of the Bible, and we learn to rely on someone else to do our thinking for us, even in spiritual things. Isn't that the same lie during the time of the Dark Ages, when the Catholic Church said, we are the ones who can interpret the Scriptures, we're going to chain this up to the wall, and you have to trust your priests and your pastors for the interpretation of the Bible? We're not a whole lot different from that. If all we're doing is relying on the pastor or some great speaker to interpret for us, we need to be digging and studying for ourselves. And yet we find it difficult because year after year in the school system, we're being conditioned to just take someone else's word for it. And so if we're doing that in the school system, we're going to do the same thing in church. You see how deep this goes, how much of a mindset change this involves. All right, let's talk about some other tactics. Poor health and nutrition. God has given us a health message, and I am so grateful for it. This health message, though, is not just to make us look better and live longer. The main purpose of this health message is for the health of our minds, so that we can commune with God, so that we can be able to make good decisions. I think about Daniel. We talked about him this morning. Daniel allowed them to change his name, which was significant. They were trying to convert him to the false gods. Daniel allowed them to put him through a course of indoctrination at the Babylonian University. But when it came to his diet, he would rather die than compromise, because he knew that would affect his ability to communicate with God and to make good decisions. That should tell us something about how important this is. And there's a lot of research on this. Just for a few examples, we know that myelin, which is an essential component of brain development, is made up of a lot of essential fatty acids that are found in the perfect balance and proportion in the mother's breast milk. Any coincidence there? Do you think God created the perfect diet for the little infant so their brain could develop perfectly? Yeah, amazing. Adequate green leafy vegetables are known to be important for the development of the hippocampus, part of the brain, important for memory. They did a study of 1 million students in New York. That's a big study, by the way. And they found that those students who consumed lunches that did not include artificial additives, preservatives, dyes, and things like that did 14% better on IQ tests just by removing those additives from their meals. We know that sugar negatively impacts the development of the brain, and I could go on and on and on. God has given us a health message. I encourage you, study it, apply it. It is for the health of our minds so that we can communicate with Him and be strengthened for the last days. Point number 6, age segregation. Now, this is a fascinating one. Have you noticed the trend in society in recent years that children are spending the majority of their time with others of the same age, more or less? Not so much time with adults as they used to spend. And it's interesting that something can become so normal in society that we assume it's good. Something becomes so normal we assume it's good. Children spend their lives now with other children of the same age, pretty much, in school, in church, in the recreation. It's all with others, basically the same age. And we think that it's good or even essential for their socialization, right? You've heard this. What does the research say? Well, the placement of children in separate classes with others of the same age is a fairly recent phenomenon. Age segregation did not occur in full force until the advent of compulsory education laws brought a large influx of children to the public school system. All right, this is a scientist writing a little complicated here, but basically he's saying up until the late 1800s, if you look at the history of it, children learned in the context of the home or sometimes a one-room schoolhouse. It was an age-mixed environment. But then compulsory education comes along in the late 1800s, requiring millions of children to enter the school system. And what is the logical way to organize children? By age, right? It's logical. I understand why it was done. Was it good? Is it helpful? Never in history until the 20th century have young people been largely separated from the ongoing productive activities of society. What are we doing? Separating children from real life. Is this even normal? Does such division take place naturally anywhere? In industry, do all 21-year-old laborers work separately from 20-year-olds or 23-year-olds? In business, are there separate rooms for 30-year-old executives and 31-year-old executives? Clearly not. Where on earth was this idea conceived? Is anything more, interesting word he uses here, is anything more socially damaging than segregating children by year for 14 or often 18 years? Socially damaging, he says. But what is the number one argument given as to why children need to be with children the same age? Socialization, right? And he says, no, it's not helping. It's hurting socialization. Now, I know that comes as a shock. Let me talk about a few elements of this. The Russian developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, if you study psychology in university, you came across that name, I'm sure. He developed something known as the zone of proximal development. And he said that children develop primarily by attempting tasks they can accomplish only in collaboration with a more competent individual. Now that's a little complicated, I understand. Let's give a basic example. Imagine a little 2 or 3-year-old child toddling along, and he finds a ball. And he picks up this ball and he's happy about it. And he goes toddling along and he's giggling and laughing about his ball. And he finds another 2-year-old. And he says, hey, wait a second there. Back up a little. Let's play a game of catch. And they back up and they start throwing this ball back and forth. And some of you are smiling like, no, 2 years old, 3 years old, that wouldn't be possible. Neither of them are coordinated well enough to be able to do this game of catch. No zone of proximal development going on here. Let's imagine, though, we had a 2, 3-year-old. He toddles along, he picks up his ball, he goes along until he finds a young person, an adult, a 15-year-old, 10-year-old, a parent, a grandparent, anyone. And the older person says, all right, hey, let's play. And they take the ball, hold out your arms, and they instruct it, and throw the ball into his, and when he makes a crazy throw, the adult goes over, picks it up, and continues the game. Now we have a zone of proximal development, because this was a task he could accomplish only as he was in collaboration with a more competent individual. And what the research shows is most cognitive development occurs within this zone. When it's just the 2, 3-year-old children trying to play a game of catch, there's no learning really that happens there, right? But when you have the 3-year-old and the adult, now you have learning, you have cognitive development because it's something he could do only as he works with a more competent individual. And so the research actually shows children learn a lot better in an age-mixed environment. They'll do better academically, according to the research. They have better self-esteem. And again, that's not prideful, that's a sense of self-worth, which really is just, it's logical. As children are in the age-segregated environment, they're just a number. They're one of many. In an age-mixed environment, they're a valuable contribution to the group. But most amazingly, the research has shown better socialization skills among children of age-mixed environments. Better socialization skills. They did, and there's a lot of research I could talk about. Actually, let me mention a quote here and then I'll talk about that. Dr. Larry Shires, quite famous for research on socialization. The results seem to show that a child's social development depends more on adult contact and less on contact with other children as previously thought. He's saying, we used to think that children needed contact with other children for proper social development, but we now understand that that is not correct. That's an old myth, basically. Dr. Shires and a colleague, I can't remember the name, did some socialization assessments, and they said, we want to do some comparison between opposite ends of the spectrum. They took children from the conventional public school environment, and they took another group of children from the homeschool environment. which, people often say that homeschoolers aren't socialized, right? They're like, let's settle this debate and let's compare. Yes, there's a lot in between. There's private schools and charter schools and all these different church schools and things, but let's compare opposite ends. Homeschoolers, public schools. They ran their socialization assessments. They found those in the public school scored in the 27th percentile on socialization assessments, 27th percentile. They found those from the public school environment, homeschool environment, did I say that right? Those in the public school, 27th percentile. Those in the homeschool, from the homeschool environment, 88th percentile. 3 times better socialized. And they said, whoa, this isn't lining up with what we always thought. And so as they've done more research, they realize that's just kind of a myth. It's one of those things we always just assumed, well, kids need to be around kids the same age for socialization, when the research shows the opposite. It's logical too. I was talking with a friend of mine who's a professor, and he said, and teacher, and he said, look, aren't we training our children to be adults? And it's like, oh, yeah, good point. Let's think about that. Isn't our goal to train them for adulthood? And he said, children don't learn how to be adults from other children. They learn from adults. And you kind of have to oh, right. we don't think of it that way, right? But if we're preparing them for adulthood, they're going to need to spend some time around adults to know what it's like to be experienced in that life, to prepare them to enter real life as an adult. So don't get me wrong, it's fine if kids want to play together, but if we're talking about developing good, mature thinking abilities, preparation for real life, and good social skills, then spending some time with adults is much more beneficial. John Taylor Gatto, New York State Teacher of the Year, a close study of what big people were up to was always the most exciting occupation of youth. He's talking historically here. But isn't that true? Of the older generation here, you couldn't wait to go see what Grandpa was doing on the farm, or Dad was up to in the shop, or what. You were interested in what the big people were up to. You think we've kind of lost that today? Children and young people are so separated from what the adults are doing, they're hardly interested in it anymore. They live in their own world. All right, point number 7, television and electronics. Now, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that this evening, so I'm just briefly mentioning it here. Children spend more time with electronic media than they do in any other activity aside from sleep. We need to realize how invasive and pervasive this is. And a lot of attention has been given to the dangers of bad content in the media, but the reality is that media itself is negatively affecting the development of the brain. And so we need to take this seriously, and definitely is conditioning children, as we're talking about the context of developing thinking skills, it is conditioning children and young people to reflect and not to think for themselves. Because it's just a bombardment from YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and whatever else, Graham, of what someone else is doing rather than thinking for yourself. And this is what we'll be covering tonight. So let's move on here. Point number 8, an education chiefly of the mind. Well, this is a kind of an interesting concept. We talked earlier today about a need for harmonious education, physical, mental, and spiritual. The world tends to focus just on mental development, but the Christian says, no, we need harmonious development because we're restoring the image of God in the soul. An education derived chiefly from books leads to superficial thinking. Now, are books bad? Are we all asleep? Are books bad? No, I love books. Books are great. For some odd reason, my family will not let me in a used bookstore anymore because I always come out with an armload. And they said, you need to read the ones you already have. But no, I love books. Books are great. But that can't be the sole source of an education. An education derived chiefly from books leads to superficial thinking. Why? Because you're reflecting what someone else has said rather than developing thoughts for yourself. What else is needed? Practical work encourages close observation and independent thought. How many can attest to that? The value of practical work, of having to focus and figure something out when you're working with your hands. Yeah. Oops. Point number 9, a lack of training to think. And that kind of encapsulates everything we've talked about already, but just to add the point that it is important that we're teaching our children how to think, and there are very many ways that we can do that. One of them, allowing children to figure things out for themselves, not hovering over them and, oh, you won't be able to do that. Well, hey, let them try. I remember I was with a family. We were doing some work together, and the little 3-year-old went to pick up a box. No, she wasn't going to get hurt. She was just wanting to pick this box up. And the mom's like, oh, no, that's going to be too heavy for you. And I thought to myself, no, let her try, because she's going to learn some thinking skills if she just gives it a try. Let them learn by exploring. Again, figuring things out for themselves. And then thirdly, allowing them to make some minor mistakes. Minor mistakes are important. Sometimes we call that the school of hard knocks, right? But yeah. But even before that school of hard knocks, there's the little knocks of just childhood. So many times we want to prevent our children from making those mistakes. And I'm talking mainly practical mistakes. I'm talking when they drop the glass dish that they're carrying and it breaks. Now what do they have to do? Clean it up, right? And they learn to think, I need to be more careful next time. What you're doing, those practical things, you're teaching what's called cause to effect reasoning. And cause to effect reasoning lays the foundation for this good critical thinking decision making that we're talking about. But many times we get it a little bit backwards. We tend to focus heavily on physical safety. Now, don't get me wrong, it's good to protect our children physically. But sometimes we overprotect physically. We don't allow some minor mistakes in the everyday life, some little ouches and bruises. And we're really we are extra permissive over the moral decision making. We're like, well, the moral things, that's their decision. It really should be the other way around. We should allow that's their decision about getting hurt in a little way, and take a stand about moral issues. Because the physical, the little oopsies and the bruises teach them to think and make better moral decisions later on. And it lays the foundation for that good moral decision making. Point number 10. Now, this is a significant factor. I've mentioned it already. I just want to talk about all the negative effects that it causes, an inability to think formally, a disorganization of the brain, learned helplessness, learning disabilities, many eye problems, a lot of school burnout, school dropout, a lack of spirituality, ADHD, a lot of learning disabilities. It's a major cause of our young people leaving the church and a major cause of a lack of thinking skills. We don't have time to get into it fully right now, so I will mention it and encourage you, again, go to our website, go to our YouTube channel, take some of the resources that we have or will have this evening at the ministry barn. But to put it succinctly, it's the early formal academic training and going to school at too early an age. And again, I could spend the next 3 hours going through the science as to why this is true. It is one of Satan's greatest attacks on our children today, getting them into that academic training environment at too early of an age. The brain isn't ready for it. The eyes aren't ready for it. The emotional development is not ready for it. Language skills are not ready for it. I could literally go on down the list. There is a huge amount of research and science on this. But it's just amazing to me because we have that statement, several statements in the Spirit of Prophecy, one from Christian Education, page 8, that says, in the first few years of a child's life, the greatest attention needs to be given to the physical constitution. And for the first 8 or 10 years, the mother should be the only teacher. The parents, it says the parents should be the only teacher. Nature should be the lesson book. And the open air be the classroom. God gave us that counsel. And now the research has made that unbelievably clear. And I wish we had time to get into it. But again, I encourage you to go to our webpage, go to our YouTube channel, and you can learn more about that. I want to finish up with bringing us back around to this battle between true and false education, between thinking and reflecting. You see, it is Satan's goal to get us to reflect, because he knows he'll have the greatest success in the last days if we're reflecting what someone else is doing. And if there's a true, there's a false. I'd like to read something from, I don't have the book with me, I'll put it here on the slide, Studies in Christian Education by Dr. E.A. Sutherland, one of our early pioneers. He was part of the founder for Andrews back in the day when it was a center of true education, and then went on to Madison School. I'm sure many of us have heard of that school. Anyone read Studies in Christian Education? Seen the book? It is a treasure. It is a life-changing book. I've lost count of the number of young people I've given this book to. I said, as they're in that stage of making decisions, life decisions, read this book, and it has turned their life around. It's incredible. But he talks about, for a little time, he talks about the history of the Reformation and the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. It's something we often forget about, but at the time when the Protestant Reformation was enjoying such incredible success, but as we neared the end of Luther and Melanchthon's life, Luther and Melanchthon had focused heavily on schools, on education. Their goal, specifically stated, Melanchthon said that they want to make, I don't remember who said it. Anyway, it was their goal to make Protestants out of the children. They knew they could have success if they made Protestants out of the children. And they turned the nation of Germany around in a space of 40 years. Well, obviously that got the attention of the papacy. They began a system of schools also. And we call that today the Counter-Reformation. It's still going on, unfortunately. The key players were the Jesuits, who were teachers in the schools. Every Jesuit was a teacher. Not the case now, but that's the way it was then. The Jesuits were started as an order of teachers in the schools, directly designed to work against what the Protestant Reformation was doing. And it's interesting to study their methods, because as you look at their methods, you go, oh, we're still doing that today. We still see the influences today. Let me read you. Studies in Christian Education, E.A. Sutherland. The following methods of teaching are characteristic of the Jesuit schools. The memory was cultivated as a means of keeping down, or suppressing, free activity of thought and clearness of judgment. It sought showy results with which to dazzle the world. A well-rounded development was nothing. The Jesuits did not aim at developing all the faculties of their pupils. Do you see what's going on here? The memory is cultivated to suppress free activity of thought and clearness of judgment. Like we talked about, year after year, giving students textbooks, tell them just remember it. When a student could make a brilliant display from the resources of a well-stored memory, he had reached the highest points to which the Jesuits sought to lead him. Originality and independence of mind, love of truth for its own sake, the power of reflecting and forming correct judgments were not merely neglected, they were suppressed in the Jesuit system. Now let's pair this with what we have. Again, back to the book Education, page 230. For ages, education has had to do chiefly with the memory. This faculty has been taxed to the utmost, while the other mental powers have not been correspondingly developed. Students have spent their time in laboriously crowding the mind with knowledge, very little of which could be utilized. Does that sound familiar? Filling the mind with knowledge, very little of which can be utilized. That's the plan of developing a reflector and not a thinker. Now this one caught me by surprise. Continuing on, Education 230. The mind thus burdened with that which it cannot digest and assimilate is weakened. And I said, wait a second. I think just recently before I had read this, someone had sent me an email for a consultation, and they were talking about this method of education which claims that little children are like sponges. Is that true? Yeah, absolutely. And it said, so what we need to do is just fill the mind with information and someday they'll use it. And what does this say? The mind burdened with that which it cannot digest and assimilate. In other words, that which can't be put into use is not strengthened, Not stored for later use like a computer. No, the mind will be weakened. Interesting. Notice what else happens. It becomes incapable of vigorous self-reliant effort and is content to depend on the judgment and perception of others. That should give us chills. Content to depend on the judgment and perception of others. Is that what we want for our children and young people? Continuing, the education that consists in the training of the memory, tending to discourage independent thought, has a moral bearing which is too little appreciated. As the student sacrifices the power to reason and judge for himself, he becomes incapable of discriminating between truth and error and falls an easy prey to deception. He is easily led to follow tradition and custom. Notice the progression here. First of all, as he reflects what other people have told him, as he goes through this education where he's just taking the information in, spitting it out on the test, he's sacrificing the power to reason and judge for himself. Then he becomes incapable of discriminating between truth and error because you're dependent on someone else to do the thinking for you. Falls an easy prey to deception. Easily led to follow tradition and custom. Is that what Satan wants for the end times? It's exactly what he wants. And you say, well, is this really going on today? Let's fast forward. Education should provide the means to destroy free will. What in the world? Who would have said that? That came from Johann Gottlieb Fichte. In his address to the German nation, where he laid it down that if you want to influence the student at all, you must do more than merely talk to him. You must fashion him, and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. Make him think a certain way, so when he leaves school, he can't think any other way. That was 1807. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and you say, well, how in the world does that apply to us today? All right, let's have a little history lesson here. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, addressed to the German nation, this was known as Prussia at the time, and this here we see the beginnings of the Prussian educational system. The Prussian educational system was very modeled after that counter-reformational system a couple of hundred years previous, but it was a system designed for purpose. What was the purpose? To create a population ready to do what they were told. Why? Industry. The Industrial Revolution. They needed workers in the factories. What was the effect in Germany? We've already read it. 130 more or less years later, how fortunate for leaders that men do not think in the same part of the world. But think about where this happened. Think about Germany. Do you know the history of Germany? Have you studied this? Have you studied the Great Controversy? You know what happened here? This was a nation which was first in the Reformation. This was a nation that was first in starting Christian schools. This was a nation that invented the printing press, distributed Bibles. These were strong Christians who were not afraid to be different and stand for their beliefs. And yet we see an entire nation swayed by the rhetoric of one man, loving, adoring, voting him into power. Why? That Counter-Reformation had done its job too well. That Counter-Reformation through education and the completion of those principles found in the Prussian educational system, I find it interesting that Satan made such a bold attack on this bulwark of Protestantism. Where do you think he might turn his attention to next? How about the next bulwark of Protestantism? The United States of America. Did we see that happen? Elwood Cubberley, writing about public education in the United States in 1934. The school reorganized its teaching along lines dictated by the new psychology of instruction which had come to us from abroad. Where was abroad? Prussia. Study. You can go look it up in the history books. It's easy to trace. Beginning around 1880 to 1885, our schools began to experience a new but steady change in purpose. What was the change in purpose? The U.S. Bureau of Education referred to the problem of educational schooling. I thought schooling was supposed to be educational. They said, no, that's a problem. Decrying the fact that inculcating knowledge enables the masses to be able to perceive and calculate their grievances. Such an enabling is bound to retard the growth of industry. You see a little motivation here? The Rockefeller General Education Board. We know the name Rockefeller, I'm sure. Big names in industry. Why would they have a General Education Board? Why would they care about education? The reality is they were one of the greatest influencers in the modern school system in America. And they said, in our dreams, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. Sound like reflectors or thinkers? William Torrey Harris, interesting name. William Torrey Harris was, talk about who he was momentarily here. William Torrey Harris was one of the key people who established, see if I can get this, pardon. He established kindergarten as fundamental to our educational system. He established high school as fundamental to our education. In other words, he extended, he developed ways to keep the children in the system longer. And he said 99 students out of 100 are automata, machines in other words. Careful to walk in prescribed paths, careful to follow the prescribed custom. This is not an accident, but the result of substantial education. This man was the Commissioner of Education for the United States for 17 years. He knows what he's talking about. He says, why are people doing things the way they do them? Why do people just go along and don't think for themselves? It's because of the educational system that we've designed. These leaders and designers of the modern educational system were joined by scientists who studied social control. Here's a quote from Edward Ross on his book of Social Control. It is the work of schools to collect little plastic lumps of human dough from private households and shape them on the social kneading board. You see what the goal is here? It's scary. Absolutely, it's scary. This one is chilling. Bertrand Russell, Impact of Science on Society. It is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments much more control over individual mentality than they now have, even in totalitarian countries. Fichte, speaking of that man from Prussia, laid it down that education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. Pretty horrible, isn't it? Does this maybe help us make a little more sense of why the system is the way it is, though? I think when we understand that it was actually designed to operate the way that it operates, we're not so confused as to why it's so messed up. People say, we need a reform in the educational system. It's broken. I disagree. I don't think the system's broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. What we need is a different system. What we need is God's system. True education. Where is that found? Right in the home, right? Right in the home. That bulwark against the attacks of Satan. And we have right there that counsel that we've read this morning from Deuteronomy chapter 6, where God tells the parents exactly how they are to educate their children. And he says, talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. In other words, how are you going to do that if you're sending them off to someone else? To be clear, I'm not saying there's not a place for schools. Schools can do a good work if they're structured properly. Sadly, many of them are not. Most of them are not. But it begins in the home, no matter what the school is like. God commanded Hebrews to teach their children his requirements, to make them acquainted with all his dealings with their people. The home and the school were one. In the place of stranger lips, the loving hearts of father and mother were to give instruction to their children. This is the instruction God gave the children of Israel, and he's given us the same. When he said, in his wisdom, the Lord has decreed that the family shall be the greatest of educational agencies. But what happens if you separate the children from the family? Well, then you have exactly what is intended. Elwood Carberly, writing about changing conceptions of education in 1909, the attitude toward the control of the child is likely to change. Each year the child is coming to belong more to the state and less to the parent. The plea in defense that the child is my child will not be accepted much longer by society. Was he right? How accurate was that prediction? John Dewey, father of modern public education, this statement is unclear exactly where it came from. It's attributed to him. I haven't been able to verify that. Nonetheless, it's a great statement. If the public schools can keep children occupied from 7 or 7:30 in the morning throughout the day with sports after school and homework in the evening, parents will have less than an hour a day with their children, and the family and the Christian church's influence over them could be broken in about a generation. Isn't that true? Again, I say, the devil knows what he's doing. Are we awake to his attacks? Horace Mann, one of the greatest influencers of the modern public educational system in the United States, said, we then who are engaged in the sacred cause of education, well, he got that much right, it is a sacred cause, are entitled to look upon all parents as giving hostages to our cause. The language here, it's war, he says. They're giving hostages to our cause. We know it's war. We talked about the great controversy, but I have a question for you. In what war does one side willingly give hostages to the other? But that's exactly what's going on. Friends, are we awake to this? Think about that statement we started with. Now, as never before, we need to understand the true science of education. This is urgent. We are at war. Never before was there so much at stake. Never were the results so mighty, depending upon a generation as upon these now coming upon the stage of action. Friends, how are we going to get this generation? I want to encourage you. Don't point fingers, because that's easy to do. Look how bad society's getting. Look how bad the schools are getting. Look how bad the media is getting. Look at all these bad influences on our children. Decide what you can do as a family, because you have control not over what happens out there, but over what happens within your own home. God has placed you in that position. Make it a training center for eternity. Well, let's stop there. Thank you for your time. Any questions before we close with prayer? A million? A million. I encourage you to keep studying. You know, we've just scratched the tip of the iceberg here. We're just kind of giving an intro into these things. Keep studying. Avail yourself of the resources that I have. That will be an excellent further study. And yes, you had your hand up. You got it? Okay.
The book was the
Studies on Christian Education by E.A. Sutherland. I'll have that this evening if you want to get a copy. Yep. Excellent material. All right. Well, look, I hope... Yeah, go ahead.
If all the indications are saying that we shouldn't be starting our kids until like 8 years old, then why in our church school systems are we still promoting kindergarten starting at like 6?
Yeah. At daycare, right. It's a good question, and really the only...
Is the law of the land too, start at 6?
It depends. Yeah, Michigan, there's no obligation in Michigan. You can do whatever you want in Michigan. Some states require a certain age, but in general, it's because we're following the ways of the world. I don't say that to be critical, but it's
necessity because mom and dad have to go to work.
And that's another factor, right?
There's things that they didn't have before, like insurance and expense hospital. Everything's different today than it was in the 1800s or during the 1700s. And for financial reasons, they had to make adjustments, and why waste them on a playground for 8 years when they can educate them? It's just the way they do it.
Yeah. Sadly. And, we do have counsel that we should have training centers at least to help parents who are in that situation. And I believe our church schools have a tremendous opportunity to do that. Not to take the place of the family, not to replace the family with, hey, send your kids here, we'll take care of it all for you. No, but to educate them how to do their job better and to help in those situations where they don't have that opportunity.
It's a necessary team as long as the school is a conserved school, which some of our church schools aren't conserved anymore.
Yeah.
But your best program so far was Sabbath school because it just was right at the facts of where we're hurting right now as school systems in our country as far as Adventist schools, because we are losing a lot of that. You got to have the education. We don't have a knowledge shortage. We have a lazy that don't like to study, from my observation. But you got to have that fresh air. You got to have that work, just like you say. And we're losing the fresh air and the work in our schools.
Yeah.
Fortunately, there's some conservative independents that are still holding on to Ellen White, holding on to training people in the ways that you discussed this morning was incredible.
Yeah.
So do we know if when we first started doing church schools, do we know what age they actually right from the beginning started?
Yeah, it was later. It was 8 or 10. They held to that council. And there was actually a really interesting discussion. You can read about it in third selected messages, where she actually said she recommended there was an institution, a sanitarium, and she said, you guys need to get a school started here even for your younger ones. And everybody was shocked. Like, what are you talking about? Your counsel has always been until the age of 8 or 10. And she said, yeah, but then she went on to explain, basically, the parents were letting their kids run wild while they worked, even in God's cause. And she's like, it's better that they're in school learning discipline than to just run wild with no education until they're 8 or 10. So yes, the ideal is in the home until 8 or 10, but if they're not getting that, then you're going to need to bring in something else. But I hasten to add, she explained the type of school that should be started for those young children. It wasn't the academic setting that we envision. She explained they should learn how to obey. This is a place where they learn to work, where they learn discipline, manage. It wasn't an academic setting. So even in that context where she's saying, okay, this is not the ideal situation, but if parents are not taking care of their children properly, it's better to have a school for them when they're young. But even in that school, they shouldn't be learning academic things. They should be learning the practical things that they should be learning at home. So again, exactly. But again,
idealism is homeschool, but it's such a big variable because I've observed so many homeschool families, relatives and neighbors and such, and I'm telling you, not every homeschool is equal. Some
Right.
of them are disasters.
Yeah, absolutely.
And some of them are just incredible. And
Yeah,
it's not all equal.
good
And
point.
I would say the disasters should go to church school.
Right.
I believe in the counsel that Ellen White gave between 8 and 10 years old. But do you have a curriculum that is set, or can you recommend one that is set for a later start date between 8 and 10?
Right. I should have done this session, but there's a lot to explain in that. The simple answer is no, because you don't need a curriculum. The way it works, though, is that you should be teaching from everyday life up until that age of 8 to 10, focusing on character. when you get to the later ages, it becomes a matter of taking, in other words, you're not going to, the simplest way to explain it, you're not going to take everything that was to happen in the early years and now cram it into starting at age 10. You're actually going to jump through a lot of that, and for example, let's take math for example. Okay, they're learning math from everyday life, and anyone who's worked in a school, as you have, you know that curriculum is very repetitive. You learn the same things year after year, just a little bit harder. And so you're learning from practical everyday life. That age of 8 or 10 comes, and you start taking what they already know and you put it on paper. Do they already know how to do math in the garden? Sure, no problem. Okay, take what they already know, put it on paper, and usually within a matter of weeks, they catch right up to their grade level. So you're not going to actually do everything that they would have done earlier. You're going to skip it because it's unnecessary. They understand the concept. It's a total myth that we have that there's some essential part or essential topics that are taught in the early years that if children don't have it, they're going to miss out on life. Total myth. There's nothing that's taught them that they're going to miss out on if they don't get it. If they're learning from everyday life, they jump right in on grade 3, 4, 5, whatever, wherever you bring them in at, just with a little bit of catch up, and they move right along. And in the majority of cases, they actually do far better than the ones who started earlier. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Again, I explain it a lot more in detail on my DVD series or videos online. So, all right, I think we probably best get rolling here. We need to get over to the ministry barn, and so I hope to see everybody over there. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for the privilege that we have of all this science and research, and that you have just pulled back the veil so that we can see the enemy lines and what exactly is going on to attack us. And Lord, help us, please, to be awake. Help our homes to be little training centers for heaven and preparing our young people for the crisis. I pray your blessing on each parent and teacher here. Please help them. Give them wisdom, perseverance, fortitude, whatever's needed, courage. And we ask your blessing on the remainder of this day as we head over to the ministry barn, and may your presence be with us. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.